Hook. In the unforgiving world of military training, where weakness is weeded out and only the strongest survive, some scars tell stories that even the toughest commanders aren't prepared to hear. What happens when a mark on someone's skin holds more power than any rank or medal? Sometimes the most unlikely person carries the heaviest burden, and sometimes that burden becomes their greatest strength. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training compound as Sarah Martinez adjusted her grip on the heavy equipment pack. Sweat already beaded on her forehead, though the day's real challenges hadn't even begun. Around her, 30 other recruits prepared for what their instructors had promised would be the most grueling week of their military careers. The Advanced Combat Training course was designed to break people, to separate those who merely wanted to serve from those who were willing to die for their brothers and sisters in arms. Sarah had heard the whispers since arriving at the base 3 days ago. The other recruits, mostly men in their early 20s, questioned whether she belonged here. At 28, she was older than most, and her quiet demeanor had been mistaken for weakness. They didn't know about the nights she spent running alone, pushing her body to its absolute limits. They didn't know about the careful way she chose her words, measuring each one before speaking. Most importantly, they didn't know about the story written across her skin in scars that she kept hidden beneath long sleeves, even in the sweltering heat. Commander Jake Sullivan watched the group from his position near the obstacle course. A Navy SEAL with 15 years of active duty behind him, he had seen every type of recruit imaginable. The cocky ones who thought they knew everything, the scared ones who jumped at shadows, and the quiet ones who either surprised everyone or washed out in the first week. Sarah Martinez fell into that last category, and something about her made him uneasy in a way he couldn't quite define. "Listen up," Sullivan barked, his voice carrying across the training ground with the authority of someone who had commanded respect in some of the world's most dangerous places. "Today begins your introduction to real combat scenarios. Everything you think you know about fighting, about surviving, about pushing through pain is about to be tested. Some of you will discover you're stronger than you ever imagined. Others will discover they chose the wrong career path." The recruits formed neat rows, their faces a mixture of determination and barely concealed fear. Sarah stood in the third row, her posture perfect, her eyes focused straight ahead. She had learned long ago that drawing attention to herself rarely ended well. Better to blend in, to observe, to wait for the right moment to prove herself. The first exercise was deceptively simple. A 3-mile run in full gear, followed by a series of obstacle courses that would test not just physical strength, but mental resilience. Sullivan had designed the course himself, drawing on experiences from battlefield in Afghanistan and Iraq, where split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. As the group began their run, Sarah found herself naturally falling into pace with the middle of the pack. She could have pushed harder, could have been among the leaders, but experience had taught her that standing out too early often meant becoming a target. Around her, she could hear the heavy breathing of recruits already struggling with the weight of their packs, and the oppressive heat of the morning sun. "Come on, Martinez," called out Derek Thompson, one of the recruits who had made no secret of his belief that women didn't belong in combat roles. "Don't tell me you're already falling behind." His comment drew chuckle from a few of the men running nearby, though several others remained focused on their own struggles with the demanding pace. Sarah didn't respond, didn't even look in his direction. She had dealt with Derek Thompson types her entire life, men who confused loudness with strength and cruelty with toughness. Her steady breathing and measured pace spoke louder than any comeback she could have offered. Commander Sullivan jogged alongside the group, his pace easy despite carrying the same gear as his recruits. His eyes constantly scanned the formation, noting who was struggling, who was pushing too hard too early, and who seemed to have found that perfect balance between effort and endurance. Sarah Martinez caught his attention again, not because she was exceptional, but because she seemed almost invisible, moving through the exercise with a quiet competence that suggested experience beyond her file indicated. The first obstacle appeared after 2 miles of running. a series of walls increasing in height, designed to be conquered through a combination of upper body strength, technique, and teamwork. Sullivan watched as the stronger recruits attacked the obstacles with brute force, while others struggled to find purchase on the wooden surfaces. Sarah approached the first wall methodically, studying the hand and footholds before making her attempt. Her movements were economical, precise, suggesting someone who had learned to maximize efficiency over raw power. Interesting technique, Sullivan observed to his assistant instructor, Sergeant Martinez, a Marine who had served 3 tours overseas before taking on training duties. She's not the strongest or the fastest, but look at how she moves. That's not beginner's luck. As the group progressed through the obstacle course, the Texas heat began to take its toll. Several recruits had already fallen behind, their pace slowing as dehydration and exhaustion set in. The medics followed at a discreet distance, ready to intervene if anyone pushed themselves beyond safe limits. This was training, not a suicide mission, though Sullivan knew that the line between the two could sometimes blur when people were determined to prove themselves. Sarah maintained her position in the middle of the pack, though those around her were beginning to thin out as the weaker recruits fell behind. Her breathing remained controlled, her movements still precise despite the obvious fatigue that was beginning to affect everyone. Derek Thompson, who had started the exercise with such confidence, was now struggling to keep up, his earlier bravado replaced by the grim reality of the physical demands being placed on him. The final obstacle before the return run was a rope climb, 30 feet of thick hemp rope, leading to a platform where recruits had to ring a bell before descending. Upper body strength was crucial here, but technique and mental determination were equally important. Some of the strongest men in the group had struggled with this particular challenge, their weight working against them as they tried to haul themselves upward. When Sarah's turn came, she approached the rope with the same methodical assessment she had shown throughout the morning. Her hands positioned carefully on the rough hemp, she began her ascent. Her progress was steady, but not spectacular, each movement calculated to conserve energy while maintaining forward progress. About halfway up, she paused for just a moment, and Sullivan noticed something that made him frown. For just an instant, as Sarah adjusted her grip on the rope, the sleeve of her training shirt had ridden up slightly on her left arm. What Sullivan saw in that brief moment was a glimpse of scarring, the kind of marking that spoke of trauma beyond anything most people could imagine. It was gone in a second as Sarah's sleeve fell back into place, but the image was burned into Sullivan's memory. Sarah completed the rope climb, rang the bell, and descended with the same controlled movements she had displayed throughout the exercise. As she rejoined the group preparing for the return run, Sullivan found himself studying her with new eyes. The quiet competence he had observed now took on a different meaning. This wasn't someone who was naturally gifted at military exercises. This was someone who had learned these skills through necessity, someone whose calm under pressure came from experience with real pressure, not simulated training scenarios. The return run separated the group even further. What had started as 30 recruits was now down to about 20 still moving at the required pace. The others were either being assisted by medics or had voluntarily removed themselves from the exercise. Sarah remained in her position, neither leading nor lagging, her pace as steady as it had been at the beginning of the day. As they approached the final stretch, Derek Thompson, who had been struggling for the past hour, suddenly picked up his pace. Whether driven by pride, desperation, or simple stubbornness, he began pushing harder, trying to make up for his earlier struggles. His breathing became ragged, his form deteriorated, but he continued forcing himself forward. "Slow it down, Thompson," Sullivan called out, recognizing the signs of someone pushing beyond their limits. This isn't a race. But Thompson either didn't hear or chose to ignore the command. His pace increased even more, and Sarah could see the telltale signs of someone heading for collapse. His skin had taken on an unhealthy pallor despite the heat, and his movements were becoming increasingly erratic. Without breaking her own pace or calling attention to her actions, Sarah began gradually closing the distance to Thompson. She did it so subtly that even Sullivan almost missed it, shifting her position in the group until she was running just behind and slightly to the side of the struggling recruit. When Thompson finally stumbled, his legs giving out as dehydration and exhaustion overwhelmed him, Sarah was in position to catch him before he hit the ground. "Easy," she said quietly, supporting Thompson's weight as he fought to stay conscious. "You're okay. Just breathe." Her voice was steady, calm, the voice of someone who had talked people through crises before. Sullivan was there within seconds, along with the medics, but Sarah had already begun the process of cooling Thompson down and keeping him stable. Her movements were sure and practiced as she helped position him in the recovery position, monitored his breathing, and provided the kind of immediate care that could make the difference between a training injury and something much more serious. "Where did you learn medical training?" Sullivan asked as the medics took over Thompson's care. "Around," Sarah replied, her standard non-answer for questions about her background. She stepped back to allow the professionals to work, but Sullivan noticed that she remained close enough to help if needed, her attention focused on Thompson's condition rather than her own exhaustion. As the exercise concluded and the recruits were dismissed for medical evaluation and recovery time, Sullivan found himself with more questions about Sarah Martinez than answers. Her file showed a clean record, solid test scores, and the kind of background that suggested someone seeking a fresh start in military service. But the glimpse of scarring he had seen, combined with her calm competence under pressure and knowledge of emergency medical procedures, suggested a story that wasn't contained in any official paperwork. That evening, as Sullivan reviewed the day's performance evaluations, he made a note next to Sarah's name. She had completed all requirements, helped a fellow recruit in need, and shown the kind of steady competence that marked natural leaders. But there was something else there, something that spoke of experiences that went far beyond what most people encountered in their civilian lives. The next morning brought new challenges designed to test not just physical capability, but decision-making under pressure. Urban combat scenarios using paint rounds, where split-second choices about friend or foe could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. These exercises were as much about psychology as they were about marksmanship or tactics. Sarah found herself assigned to a squad with 4 other recruits, including Derek Thompson, who had insisted on continuing despite his struggles the previous day. The scenario was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. Navigate through a mock urban environment, identify and neutralize hostile targets while protecting civilian populations, and complete the mission objective within the time limit. What made these exercises particularly challenging was the use of actors playing various roles. Some were clearly marked as hostiles, others as civilians, but many fell into gray areas that required quick judgment calls. The instructors deliberately created scenarios where the obvious choice might not be the right choice, where hesitation could be as costly as acting too quickly. As the squad moved through the first section of the mock city, Sarah naturally fell into a support position, providing cover for her teammates while maintaining awareness of their surroundings. Her movements were smooth and controlled, her weapon handling showing more proficiency than her training record would suggest. When the first contact came, simulated enemy fire erupting from a second-story window, her response was immediate and precise. "Contact 12 o'clock high," she called out, her voice clear and calm over the simulated gunfire. Her return fire was accurate, neutralizing the threat while her squad mates maneuvered to better positions. What struck Sullivan, who was observing from a concealed position, was not just her marksmanship, but her immediate tactical awareness and communication skills. The scenario became more complex as they moved deeper into the urban environment. Civilian actors appeared at unexpected moments, some running in panic, others potentially concealing weapons. The squad had to make rapid decisions about who posed a threat and who needed protection, all while maintaining progress toward their objective. It was during the third encounter that everything changed. A simulated, improvised explosive device detonated near the squad's position, creating chaos and confusion designed to test their ability to respond to unexpected events. The explosion, though harmless, was loud and realistic enough to trigger genuine stress responses in the recruits. As smoke filled the area and simulated casualties began calling for help, Sarah's response was unlike anything Sullivan had seen in training exercises. While her squad mates struggled to process what had happened and determine their next course of action, Sarah moved with the kind of purposeful calm that usually took years of combat experience to develop. She immediately began treating the simulated casualty closest to her position, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she applied the proper first aid techniques. But it was when she rolled up her sleeves to work more effectively that Sullivan got his first clear look at the scars that covered her arms. The markings were unmistakable. Burns, cuts, and other injuries that spoke of prolonged trauma, the kind of scarring that came from systematic violence rather than accidents or military combat. For just a moment, Sullivan felt something he rarely experienced in his role as a hardened military instructor: a complete inability to maintain his professional detachment. The scars told a story that no training manual covered, a narrative of survival that put every challenge these recruits faced into a different perspective. As Sarah continued working on the simulated casualty, her sleeves still rolled up and the full extent of her scarring visible, Sullivan found himself looking at her with completely new understanding. This woman hadn't come to military training seeking adventure or career advancement. She had come seeking something else entirely, something that the military could offer that civilian life had failed to provide. Safety, structure, purpose, belonging. Things that most people took for granted, but that some had to fight to achieve. As the training scenario continued around them, Sullivan remained frozen in position, unable to look away from the evidence of trauma that Sarah carried on her skin. In 15 years of military service, in combat zones where he had seen the worst that humanity could inflict on itself, he thought he had become immune to surprise. But something about this quiet recruit with her carefully hidden scars had shaken him to his core. The exercise concluded successfully, with Sarah's squad completing their objective while maintaining appropriate care for simulated casualties. As the recruits gathered for debriefing, Sarah had rolled her sleeves back down, once again concealing the story written across her skin. But Sullivan knew that he would never again look at her the same way. During the debrief, he found himself struggling to maintain his usual professional demeanor. His comments on Sarah's performance were accurate, but felt inadequate given what he now understood about her background. How do you evaluate someone's tactical skills when you know they learned them not in training, but in survival? How do you assess their ability to remain calm under pressure when their entire life had been pressure? As the recruits dispersed for evening chow, Sullivan made a decision that went against every protocol in his training manual. He needed to know Sarah's real story, needed to understand what had brought her to this place, and what she was really seeking from military service. But more than that, he needed to figure out how to help her succeed in a way that honored both her service goals and the survival she had already demonstrated. The sun was setting over the training compound as Sullivan watched Sarah walking toward the barracks. Her posture still perfect, her pace still measured and controlled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for her to prove herself or for her past to catch up with her present. But tonight, a Navy SEAL commander sat in his office, staring at training evaluations while trying to process the reality that sometimes the strongest people were those who had already survived their worst battles before they ever put on a uniform. The third day of advanced combat training dawned gray and misty, with a kind of oppressive humidity that made every movement feel labored. Commander Sullivan had spent most of the night reviewing Sarah Martinez's file, looking for clues that might explain what he had seen the previous day. The official paperwork was remarkably clean, almost suspiciously so. High school graduate, community college courses in emergency medical training, various jobs in healthcare and social services, and then a decision to enlist at 28. It read like someone starting over, which probably wasn't far from the truth. Sarah was already at the morning formation when Sullivan arrived, her uniform crisp despite the early hour, her bearing as composed as ever. She stood in the second row today, having earned a slight repositioning through her consistent performance, though she seemed unaware of or unconcerned with the subtle acknowledgement of her capabilities. Today we focus on psychological resilience, Sullivan announced to the group, his voice carrying across the assembled recruits. Combat isn't just about physical strength or tactical knowledge. It's about making decisions when you're scared, tired, and running on adrenaline. It's about functioning when everything around you is chaos and the person next to you is counting on you to keep them alive. The exercises planned for the day were designed to create controlled stress situations that would reveal how each recruit responded to pressure. Mock interrogation scenarios, sensory deprivation challenges, and problem-solving tasks under extreme time constraints. Sullivan had run these exercises hundreds of times, and he could usually predict within the first hour which recruits would excel and which would struggle. But Sarah Martinez was proving to be an exception to every pattern he thought he understood. The first challenge involved teams of 3 recruits being placed in a darkened room with limited supplies and tasked with solving a series of problems while dealing with loud noises, flashing lights, and other sensory disruptions designed to create disorientation and stress. Most recruits either became overwhelmed by the stimulation or tried to take charge too aggressively, both responses that could be problematic in real combat situations. Sarah was partnered with Derek Thompson, who was still trying to prove himself after his struggles on day one, and Lisa Chun, a 22-year-old from California who had shown promise in physical training but struggled with confidence in leadership situations. As the 3 were sealed into the challenge room, Sullivan and his assistant instructors monitored their progress through hidden cameras and microphones. The cacophony of sound hit them immediately. Sirens, shouting, the sound of explosions, and gunfire, all of volumes designed to make communication difficult and concentration nearly impossible. Flashing strobe lights created a disorienting visual environment, while the temperature in the room was gradually increased to add physical discomfort to the psychological stress. Derek's response was immediate and predictable. He began shouting orders, trying to use volume to overcome the environmental noise, his voice becoming increasingly strained as he attempted to take control of the situation. Lisa appeared overwhelmed, her movements becoming hesitant and uncertain as the sensory assault continued. Sarah's response was different. Instead of fighting against the environment, she seemed to accept it, adapting to the conditions rather than trying to control them. She moved closer to her teammates, using physical proximity and touch to communicate when verbal communication became difficult. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and clear, cutting through the chaos not through volume but through its steady tone. "Derek, take the left side," she said, her hand briefly touching his shoulder to get his attention. "Lisa, you're with me on the right. We move together, communicate through touch if we have to. The noise is just noise. It can't hurt us." What struck Sullivan as he watched was not just her tactical approach to the problem, but the way her teammates responded to her calm presence. Derek's frantic energy began to settle into more purposeful action, while Lisa's uncertainty transformed into focused determination. Sarah had become an anchor point for the team without ever announcing herself as the leader. As the challenges within the room escalated, requiring the team to solve increasingly complex problems while the environmental stressors continued, Sarah's background began to show in ways that should have been impossible for someone with her official training record. She demonstrated familiarity with situations that most civilian-trained individuals would never have encountered. When a scenario required them to provide medical aid to a simulated casualty while under fire, Sarah's movements were those of someone who had done this before, in real conditions rather than training scenarios. She positioned herself to shield the casualty while working, her hands steady despite the continued sensory assault, her medical knowledge extending far beyond basic first aid. Where did she learn to work under pressure like that? Sergeant Martinez asked, echoing Sullivan's own thoughts as they watched the exercise unfold. "I don't think she learned it," Sullivan replied slowly. "I think she lived it. The team successfully completed all challenges within the time limit, with Sarah's steady presence allowing Derek and Lisa to perform at levels that their individual capabilities might not have supported. As they emerged from the challenge room, sweating and exhausted but successful, Sullivan noticed something that confirmed his growing suspicions about Sarah's background. While Derek and Lisa showed the typical signs of stress recovery, the elevated breathing and slight tremors that were normal after intense psychological pressure, Sarah appeared remarkably composed. Her breathing was steady, her hands still, her overall demeanor suggesting someone for whom this level of stress was not particularly unusual. During the debrief session that followed, Sullivan asked each team member to describe their experience and what they had learned about working under pressure. Derek spoke about the importance of communication and teamwork, lessons that were appropriate for his level of experience. Lisa discussed overcoming fear and trusting her teammates, equally valid insights for someone early in their military training. When Sarah's turn came, her response was notably different. "Stress is information," she said simply. "It tells you what matters and what doesn't. When everything is loud and chaotic, you learn to focus on what you can control and accept what you can't." The team succeeded because we adapted to the environment instead of fighting it. Her words carried the weight of experience that went far beyond the training scenario they had just completed. Sullivan found himself studying her face as she spoke, noting the careful way she chose her words, as if she was translating experiences that couldn't be fully shared into language that would be acceptable in their current context. The afternoon brought individual psychological evaluations, one-on-one sessions with military psychologists designed to assess each recruit's mental resilience and identify any issues that might affect their ability to serve effectively. These sessions were standard practice, though Sullivan knew that they often revealed information that recruits preferred to keep private. As the other recruits rotated through their evaluation sessions, Sullivan found himself in his office, ostensibly reviewing training schedules, but actually struggling with a decision that could affect both his career and Sarah's future. Military regulations were clear about the chain of command and the appropriate channels for addressing concerns about recruit backgrounds. But those regulations have been written for normal circumstances, and nothing about Sarah Martinez seemed normal. A knock on his office door interrupted his internal debate. "Come in," he called, expecting one of his assistant instructors with an update on the afternoon evaluations. Instead, Sarah Martinez entered, her posture as perfect as ever, but something different in her expression. "Sir, I'd like to request a private meeting at your convenience. There are some things about my background that might be relevant to my training evaluation." Sullivan gestured to the chair across from his desk, noting that Sarah closed the door behind her before sitting down. Her movements were controlled and deliberate, suggesting someone who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to follow through with it. "What's on your mind, Martinez?" Sullivan asked, though he suspected he already knew. "You saw the scars yesterday during the urban combat exercise," Sarah said directly, without any attempt to deflect or minimize. "I know you did because your whole demeanor changed afterward. I've been thinking about whether to address it directly or let you draw your own conclusions, and I've decided that honesty serves everyone better." Sullivan felt a moment of respect for her directness, even as he recognized the courage it must have taken to initiate this conversation. "I'm listening," he said simply. "The official story in my file is true as far as it goes," Sarah continued. "But it doesn't include everything, because some things aren't appropriate for official documentation. I spent 7 years in an abusive relationship that escalated over time, from emotional manipulation to physical violence to—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Systematic torture designed to break my will and make me completely dependent." The clinical way she described her experience was almost more disturbing than emotional recounting might have been. Sullivan had heard trauma narratives before, but there was something about Sarah's matter-of-fact delivery that spoke to a level of processing and survival that few people achieved. "The medical training in my file," Sarah continued, "I learned that because I was treating my own injuries and couldn't go to hospitals or doctors without raising questions I wasn't ready to answer. The emergency response capabilities you observed? Those came from 7 years of managing crisis situations on a daily basis. The ability to remain calm under pressure? That was a survival skill long before it became a military asset. Sullivan found himself leaning back in his chair, processing information that explained so many of the observations he had made over the past 3 days. "What changed?" he asked. "What made you able to leave?" For the first time since entering his office, Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "He made a mistake," she said quietly. "He assumed that breaking someone physically was the same as breaking them completely. When the opportunity came to escape, I took it, and I made sure he would never be in a position to hurt me or anyone else again." The implication in her words was clear, though she hadn't explicitly stated what action she had taken. Sullivan realized he was sitting across from someone who had not only survived prolonged trauma, but had ultimately taken decisive action to end it, regardless of the personal cost. "The psychological evaluation this afternoon," Sullivan said. "How did that go?" "The psychologist asked a lot of questions about my motivation for military service and my ability to handle stress," Sarah replied. "I gave honest answers within the parameters of what was appropriate to share. I told him I was seeking structure, purpose, and the opportunity to use difficult experiences to help others. All of which is true." Sullivan nodded, understanding the careful balance Sarah had maintained between honesty and discretion. Military psychologists were skilled at detecting deception, but they were also trained to respect the privacy of experiences that didn't directly impact military readiness. "Why are you telling me this?" Sullivan asked. "You could have let me wonder, could have maintained your privacy. Because you're evaluating my fitness for service, and you deserve to make that evaluation based on accurate information," Sarah replied. "Also because I've observed how you interact with your recruits, and I believe you care more about developing soldiers than following procedural requirements." The conversation was interrupted by another knock on Sullivan's door. "Sir, you asked to be notified when the psychological evaluations were complete," came the voice of Sergeant Martinez through the door. "Thank you, Sergeant. I'll be out in a few minutes," Sullivan replied, then turned his attention back to Sarah. "We need to finish this conversation, but not here and not now. Are you free after evening chow?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, standing and preparing to leave. "Martinez," Sullivan called as she reached the door. "Thank you for trusting me with this information. It won't leave this room without your permission." After Sarah left, Sullivan sat alone in his office, staring at training evaluations that now seemed inadequate to capture the reality of what he was dealing with. Sarah Martinez wasn't just another recruit trying to prove she belonged in the military. She was someone who had already proven her survival capabilities under conditions that most combat veterans had never experienced. The evening meeting took place in a small conference room away from the main training areas, private enough for sensitive conversations, but official enough to maintain proper military protocols. Sarah arrived precisely on time, her bearing as composed as ever despite the personal nature of their earlier discussion. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Sullivan began, "and I have questions that go beyond simple curiosity. Your experiences, while obviously traumatic, seem to have given you capabilities that are unusual for someone at your level of formal training. I need to understand how that affects your integration with this program and your future military service." Sarah nodded, seeming to have expected this line of inquiry. "The skills I developed during those 7 years are real, and they're applicable to military service, but they come with psychological costs that I've been working to manage. I've been in therapy for 2 years. I have coping strategies for stress and triggers, and I have a clear understanding of my limitations and capabilities." "What are your limitations?" Sullivan asked directly. "I don't work well with authority figures who use intimidation or physical dominance as management tools," Sarah replied. "I have an automatic response to perceived threats that can be intense, though I've learned to manage it. I struggle with situations where I feel trapped or unable to control my environment. But I also have strengths that balance those limitations, such as I function exceptionally well in actual crisis situations. I can make decisions quickly when lives are at stake. I don't panic under pressure, and I can help others stay calm when everything is falling apart. I'm naturally protective of people who are vulnerable or hurt, and I understand viscerally what it means to fight for something that matters. Sullivan found himself nodding as Sarah spoke, recognizing that she was describing many of the qualities that made exceptional soldiers. "What do you want from military service?" he asked. "I want to be useful," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I want to take the things I learned in the worst period of my life and use them to help protect people who can't protect themselves. I want to be part of something larger than my own survival. And I want to prove, mostly to myself, that I can be trusted with responsibility for other people's welfare." The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics that range from Sarah's specific training goals to her long-term plans for military service. By the end of it, Sullivan had developed a clear picture of someone who brought unique capabilities to military service while also presenting unique challenges for integration and development. As they prepared to conclude the meeting, Sullivan made a decision that would affect both of their futures. "Martinez, I'm going to make some recommendations about your training path that go beyond the standard program. You have capabilities that shouldn't be wasted on routine assignments, but you also need development in areas that most recruits don't. Are you willing to accept additional challenges in exchange for additional opportunities?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied immediately. "What kind of challenges?" "Leadership training, specialized tactical development, and advanced medical certification. But also continued psychological support and mentorship from someone who understands combat trauma. It means a longer training period and higher expectations, but it also means preparation for roles where your unique background becomes an asset rather than something to manage." As Sarah left the meeting, both she and Sullivan understood that their relationship had shifted from instructor and recruit to something more complex. She was still under his command and still subject to military discipline and requirements, but there was now an element of mutual respect and understanding that would influence how her training progressed. The next morning brought new challenges designed to test leadership under pressure, with recruit teams rotated through command positions while dealing with complex tactical scenarios. When Sarah's turn came to lead, Sullivan watched with particular interest to see how her background would translate into military leadership style. Her approach was markedly different from the other recruit leaders. Where most tried to command through authority or volume, Sarah led through competence and calm presence. She positioned herself where she could best support her team's efforts, communicated clearly without being domineering, and demonstrated the kind of situational awareness that allowed her to anticipate problems before they became critical. Most tellingly, when a scenario required her team to deal with simulated casualties under fire, her leadership became almost instinctual. She coordinated medical aid, tactical positioning, and communication with an efficiency that suggested deep familiarity with exactly these types of high-stress, life-or-death situations. "That's not something you can teach," Sergeant Martinez observed, watching Sarah's team successfully complete an exercise that had challenged every previous group. "That's something you earn." Sullivan nodded, understanding that he was watching someone whose military training was really just a formalization of survival skills that had been tested under conditions more brutal than most combat situations. The challenge now was helping Sarah channel those skills into military service while supporting her continued healing from the trauma that had created them. As the training week continued, other recruits began to recognize Sarah's capabilities, though they couldn't understand their source. She became someone they turned to during difficult exercises, not because she demanded leadership, but because she provided the steady presence that made success more likely. Her quiet competence was earning her a level of respect that couldn't be forced or faked. But Sullivan also noticed signs that the intensive training environment was creating stress for Sarah in ways that might not affect other recruits. Her hypervigilance, useful in combat scenarios, meant she was constantly monitoring her environment for potential threats. Her protective instincts, valuable for team cohesion, sometimes put her in positions where she was taking on more responsibility than was necessary or healthy. During another private conversation later in the week, Sarah acknowledged these concerns. "I know I'm carrying more than my share," she admitted. "But seeing other people struggle when I know I can help, it's hard to step back and let them figure out on their own." "That instinct will make you a good soldier," Sullivan replied, "but it might make you a dead soldier if you don't learn to balance it with appropriate boundaries." "You can't save everyone, Martinez. Sometimes your job is to complete the mission, not to protect every member of your unit from every possible harm." It was a lesson that most soldiers learned gradually through training and experience, but for Sarah it represented a fundamental shift in thinking that had kept her alive for 7 years. Learning to balance protective instincts with military objectives would be one of her greatest challenges and one of her most important developments as a service member. As the week drew toward its conclusion, Sullivan found himself writing evaluation reports that struggled to capture the full reality of Sarah Martinez's capabilities and potential. The standard categories and metrics seemed inadequate to describe someone whose qualifications came from survival rather than training, whose leadership style was rooted in trauma but expressed through competence and care for others. In the end, his recommendation was simple but significant. Sarah Martinez should be advanced to specialized training programs that would allow her unique background to become an asset for military service while providing the continued support she needed to integrate successfully into military culture. It was a recommendation that recognized both her exceptional potential and her specific needs, treating her not as a typical recruit, but as someone whose path to military service had been anything but typical. The final day of the training week would bring the ultimate test, an exercise designed to combine everything the recruits had learned while placing them under the kind of pressure that revealed character rather than just capability. For Sarah, it would be an opportunity to demonstrate that her survival of personal trauma had prepared her for military service in ways that went far beyond what any training program could provide. The final exercise of advanced combat training began at 0300 hours, when most of the world was still asleep, and the pre-dawn darkness created an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. The remaining 18 recruits, those who had survived the grueling week of physical and psychological challenges, gathered in full combat gear for what Commander Sullivan had described as their ultimate test. "Everything you've learned this week comes together now," Sullivan announced to the assembled group. "This exercise will test not just your individual capabilities, but your ability to function as a unit under conditions that simulate real combat stress. You will be given a mission objective, limited resources, and time constraints that require you to make decisions quickly and live with the consequences." The scenario was complex by design. The recruits would be divided into 3 teams of 6, each tasked with different aspects of a coordinated mission to rescue hostages from simulated enemy compound. The exercise would unfold over 12 hours, with each team facing obstacles that required not just tactical skill, but genuine leadership, sacrifice, and the ability to adapt when plans inevitably went wrong. Sarah found herself assigned as the second in command of Team Alpha, with Derek Thompson designated as team leader in what Sullivan privately hoped would be a learning experience for both of them. The other team members included Lisa Chun, whose confidence had grown throughout the week, and 3 other recruits who had shown varying levels of capability and resilience during the previous exercises. The mission briefing revealed the complexity of what they were attempting. Intelligence reports indicated that civilian hostages were being held in a mock urban compound, defended by instructors playing the role of hostile forces. The compound was designed to be nearly impregnable through direct assault, requiring teams to coordinate their efforts and use tactics that minimize casualties while maximizing the chance of successful rescue. What made the exercise particularly challenging was the introduction of variables that couldn't be planned for in advance. Weather conditions were deliberately unpredictable, with smoke machines and artificial fog creating visibility problems. Communication equipment would be subject to random failures, forcing teams to operate independently when coordination was most needed. And, most significantly, each team would face moral dilemmas designed to test their judgment under pressure. As Team Alpha moved toward their initial objective, Sarah found herself falling into the support role she had perfected throughout the week. Derek Thompson's leadership style was improving, though he still tended toward overcommunication when stress levels increased. Sarah provided quiet guidance when needed, but allowed him to maintain command authority while she focused on tactical awareness and team cohesion. The first phase of the mission required infiltrating the outer perimeter of the compound without being detected by roving patrols. This meant moving slowly and carefully through terrain that offered limited concealment, while coordinating with the other teams to ensure simultaneous advancement. The skills Sarah had developed during her years of survival served her well here, as she demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to move silently and detect potential threats before they became problems. "How does she do that?" whispered one of the team members as Sarah guided them around a patrol that would have compromised their position. "It's like she can see in the dark." What they didn't understand was that Sarah's hypervigilance, developed through years of needing to anticipate violence, had given her sensory awareness that went far beyond normal training. She could hear footsteps before others noticed them, could detect movement in peripheral vision that most people would miss, and could sense the tension that preceded dangerous encounters. These skills, born from trauma, had become tactical advantages that no classroom instruction could provide. As they reached the first checkpoint, the teams received updated intelligence that changed the nature of their mission. The hostage situation was more complex than initially reported, with some of the captives being children and others being wounded individuals who would require immediate medical attention. The rescue operation would need to prioritize the most vulnerable while maintaining operational security for everyone involved. Derek Thompson's response to this information revealed both his growth as a leader and his continuing limitations. He immediately began revising their tactical approach, showing good strategic thinking, but he also became increasingly focused on the technical aspects of the mission at the expense of its human elements. "We need to establish a medical staging area here," he announced, pointing to a position on their map. "Lisa, you and Rodriguez will be responsible for casualty evacuation. Martinez, I want you with the assault team breaching the main building." Sarah recognized the tactical soundness of the plan, but she also saw potential problems that Derek's focus on logistics was overlooking. "Sir," she said quietly, "if we're dealing with traumatized hostages, especially children, the person providing initial contact is going to be crucial. Maybe we should consider who has the best chance of gaining their trust quickly." It was a subtle suggestion, offered in a way that supported Derek's authority while pointing out factors he hadn't considered. Sarah understood that rescued hostages, particularly children who had been subjected to captivity, would need immediate psychological care as much as medical attention. Her own experience with trauma gave her insights into what would help these simulated victims feel safe enough to cooperate with their rescue. Derek paused, processing Sarah's input, then made a decision that showed his development as a leader. "You're right," he said. "Martinez, I want you with the entry team, but your primary responsibility is initial contact with the hostages. Get them calm, get them organized, and get them ready for evacuation. Lisa, your backup medical, but also backup communication with any children we encounter." As the operation moved into its active phase, each team member's training and personal qualities were tested in ways that revealed character as much as capability. The simulated combat was intense enough to trigger genuine stress responses, with paint rounds that stung on impact and noise levels that made communication difficult. But it was the human elements of the scenario that created the real challenges. When Team Alpha breached their assigned section of the compound, they found themselves facing a situation that required immediate adaptation. The hostages they encountered included several actors playing traumatized children, an adult portraying someone with serious injuries, and others who were panicked and uncooperative. Managing the tactical situation while providing appropriate care for simulated victims required capabilities that went far beyond basic military training. Sarah's response to the scenario was unlike anything the instructors had seen from a recruit at her level. As soon as she made contact with the simulated hostages, her entire demeanor shifted from tactical operator to care provider. Her voice became soft and reassuring, her movements slow and non-threatening, and her attention focused completely on the emotional needs of the people she was trying to help. "You're safe now," she told the actor playing a frightened child, kneeling to bring herself to eye level while maintaining awareness of the tactical situation around her. "I know you're scared, but we're here to take you home. Can you tell me your name?" Her approach was professional, but deeply human, combining military efficiency with the kind of trauma-informed care that usually required specialized training. What struck Commander Sullivan, who was monitoring the exercise from the command post, was not just Sarah's technical competence, but her ability to maintain two different levels of awareness simultaneously. She was fully present for the people she was helping while remaining tactically alert to potential threats. It was a skill that suggested someone who had learned to compartmentalize extreme stress while maintaining empathy and connection to others. The exercise became more complex as it progressed, with simulated equipment failures, changing weather conditions, and evolving intelligence that required constant adaptation. When Team Alpha's communication equipment failed during a critical phase of the operation, they had to coordinate with the other teams using hand signals and predetermined protocols while managing their own piece of the mission. It was during this communication breakdown that Sarah's background became most evident. While the other team members struggled with the isolation and uncertainty of operating without radio contact, Sarah seemed almost energized by the challenge. She had learned during her years of survival that the most dangerous situations often required complete self-reliance, and she was comfortable making decisions when guidance from higher authority was unavailable. "We can't wait for orders," she told Derek when it became clear that their communication problems weren't going to be quickly resolved. "The other teams are counting on us to complete our piece of this, and those hostages need medical attention now. We have to make the call." Derek's decision to trust Sarah's judgment and proceed with their portion of the mission without explicit authorization showed his growth as a leader. But it was Sarah's ability to operate effectively in the absence of external support that demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond her official training record. The climax of the exercise came when Team Alpha encountered an unexpected complication. One of the hostages they were evacuating suffered what appeared to be a genuine medical emergency, collapsing with symptoms that suggested either a stress-induced panic attack or a more serious medical condition. The exercise protocols required treating all situations as real until proven otherwise, which meant that Sarah's medical training would be tested under actual rather than simulated conditions. Her response was immediate and professional. Within seconds, she had assessed the individual's condition, begun appropriate medical interventions, and called for real medical support while maintaining the security requirements of the ongoing exercise. Her movements were sure and practiced, suggesting someone who had dealt with genuine medical emergencies before. "I need everyone to give me space, but stay alert," she instructed her team members. "This is real, not part of the exercise. Derek, can you maintain security while I work? Lisa, I need you to guide the medics in when they arrive." What impressed Sullivan most about Sarah's handling of the situation was not just her medical competence, but her ability to manage the human dynamics of the crisis. She provided calm reassurance to the affected individual, clear direction to her team members, and accurate information to the medical personnel who responded to the emergency. Her leadership in that moment was natural and effective, born from experience rather than training. The exercise concluded successfully, with all teams completing their objectives and the medical emergency resolved without serious consequences. As the recruits gathered for final debriefing, the exhaustion on their faces was mixed with pride in what they had accomplished. They had been tested at levels that pushed their physical and psychological limits, and most had risen to meet challenges that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. During the individual evaluations that followed, Sullivan found himself writing reports that struggled to capture the full scope of what he had observed. Most of the recruits had performed at expected levels, some exceeding expectations, and others falling slightly short, but all within the normal range of military training outcomes. Sarah Martinez was different. Her evaluation required language and categories that weren't typically used for recruit assessments. She had demonstrated leadership capabilities that exceeded her rank and experience level, medical skills that went beyond standard training requirements, and psychological resilience that suggested preparation for challenges that most soldiers would never face. But more than her individual capabilities, Sarah had shown the ability to elevate the performance of everyone around her. Team members who had struggled during individual exercises performed better when working with her. Leaders who had been uncertain about their decisions gained confidence when she supported their authority. And most importantly, she had shown the ability to maintain humanity and compassion while functioning effectively in high-stress tactical situations. What do you do with someone like that? Sergeant Martinez asked as he and Sullivan reviewed the final evaluations. She's obviously capable of more than basic military service, but she's also dealing with personal history that complicates normal career progression. Sullivan had been wrestling with the same question throughout the week. Standard military procedures provided clear paths for recruits who showed exceptional promise, but those paths assumed traditional backgrounds and conventional development of capabilities. Sarah's situation required thinking outside established protocols while remaining within military regulations and career structures. We give her opportunities that match her capabilities while providing support for the areas where she needs development, Sullivan replied. And we make sure that the military benefits from what she has to offer while she gets what she needs from military service. The final conversation between Sullivan and Sarah took place in the same conference room where they had discussed her background earlier in the week. This time, the tone was different, focused on future possibilities rather than past experiences. Your performance this week has been exceptional, Sullivan began. Not just your individual skills, but your effect on other people's performance. That's not something we see very often, and it suggests potential for roles that go beyond standard military assignments. Sarah nodded, though her expression remained careful. What kind of roles? She asked. Leadership positions that involve working with people under extreme stress. Training roles where your experience could help prepare others for challenges they haven't faced yet. Specialized units where unconventional backgrounds are assets rather than complications. But all of those possibilities require additional training, security clearances, and psychological evaluations that go beyond what we've done here. What are the risks? Sarah asked directly. For both of us, I know that recommending someone with my background for advanced positions could create problems for your career if things go wrong. Sullivan appreciated her directness and her consideration of the implications for his own position. The risks are manageable if we do this right, he replied. Your psychological evaluations have been positive, your performance has been consistently excellent, and you've shown the kind of judgment that suggests you can handle increased responsibility. But it means continued scrutiny and higher standards than most people face. I'm used to higher standards, Sarah replied simply. And I'm used to scrutiny. What I'm not used to is having opportunities to use what I've learned in positive ways. As their conversation concluded, both Sullivan and Sarah understood that her military career was taking a path that neither of them could have predicted when she first arrived at the training compound. Her survival of personal trauma had prepared her for military service in ways that went far beyond what any training program could provide, but integrating those capabilities into military structure would require continued adaptation on both sides. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez graduated from Advanced Infantry School with honors and recommendations for Officer Candidate School. Her instructors noted her exceptional performance in leadership exercises, her ability to remain calm under pressure, and her positive effect on unit morale and cohesion. Her psychological evaluations continued to show steady progress in processing past trauma while developing healthy coping mechanisms for military stress. Commander Sullivan received commendation for his handling of Sarah's development, recognition that his unconventional approach to recruit assessment had identified and nurtured capabilities that might otherwise have been overlooked. His recommendation had led to opportunities that benefited both Sarah's career development and the military's access to her unique skills. During Sarah's graduation ceremony, Sullivan watched from the reviewing stand as she received recognition for academic achievement and leadership excellence. The quiet recruit who had hidden her scars beneath long sleeves had become a confident officer candidate whose background was now understood as preparation rather than liability. After the ceremony, Sarah approached Sullivan for a final conversation before reporting to her next assignment. "Thank you," she said simply, "not just for the training, but for seeing possibilities instead of problems." "You made that choice easy," Sullivan replied. "You showed up ready to work, ready to learn, and ready to contribute. Everything else was just making sure the military was smart enough to recognize what you had to offer." As Sarah left to begin the next phase of her military career, Sullivan reflected on the lessons learned from their interaction. Sometimes the strongest people were those who had already survived their worst battles. Sometimes the best soldiers were those who understood viscerally what they were fighting to protect. And sometimes the most valuable capabilities came not from training, but from the human experience of overcoming circumstances that would have broken most people. The scar that had frozen a Navy SEAL commander in recognition of trauma had become the mark of a soldier whose service would be defined not by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to do with the strength she had earned through survival. In a military culture that valued courage, resilience, and dedication to protecting others, Sarah Martinez had found not just a career, but a purpose that honored both her past struggles and her future potential. Her story became part of the institutional memory at the training facility, not as a case study in managing troubled recruits, but as an example of how military service could provide opportunities for exceptional individuals whose paths to service were anything but conventional. It was a reminder that sometimes the best soldiers were those who had already proven themselves in battles that had nothing to do with conventional warfare, but everything to do with the human capacity for survival, growth, and the transformation of trauma into strength.